started. How do you feel about this double? You like that? Okay. All right. Hello and welcome. We're so happy to have you here. I am just starting off with a few announcements for the graduate students here who would like to sign in. They're signing in with you, right?
Yeah, they've finished.
They've finished. Okay, great. Great job with that. Right after this presentation, we do have, I'm going to call it a pizza party for grad students in rate 221. And without further ado, LaTanya Trotter is going to introduce our fabulous speaker.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Professor Lauren Olsen. She is an assistant professor at Temple University, so she came all the way across the continent to be with us today. She's a medical sociologist whose work really looks at the intersection of the reproduction of inequality and medical education, and really focusing in primarily on the curriculum as an institution that shapes who physicians are. Her work has been published in Journal of Health and Social Behavior, in Social Problems, and Academic Medicine, to name a few places. And what she's going to talk to us today about is really the work centered in her book called Curricular Injustice: How U.S. Medical Schools Reproduce Inequalities. And I'm such a fan of this book. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend that you read it. Lauren, with some colleagues of hers, have really been at the forefront of resurrecting the moribund study of medical education in sociology. And her book is really a really magnificent first step in sort of resurrecting that work. And I think the thing that I really love about that work that you're going to hear about today is the way in which she really looks at curriculum itself as a kind of social institution that's sort of shaping the way through which we can understand the ways in which medicine both understands inequality, as well as the ways in which they are professionalizing their students to sort of think about it or not think about it. And so I'm going to stop talking about Lauren's work because I want you to hear about Lauren's work directly from her. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and talk to you all. Thank you so much for coming on such a beautiful day. So many thanks to LaTanya Trotter and Rowan Arar, and also for Maddie Ferris, and also you, Becca, for helping make this talk happen. So today, in my talk entitled The Promises and Pitfalls of Social Scientific Instruction in U.S. Medical Schools, I'm going to be presenting upon the research and arguments from my book. And additionally, given all of your areas of expertise, I thought it might be a nice opportunity for us to collectively abstract from my empirical case, that of professional medicine and medical education in the United States, and think through how we might better apply social scientific knowledge to improve society. And this, perhaps in this moment, might feel more urgent than ever. So, to kick things off, I'm going to tell you a story about statistics. I'm doing dual strings. So I met Dr. Carley during the course of my research for this book. And I was going around the United States to different medical schools, and I was asking medical educators as well as students, and they had different professional backgrounds and different positions of leadership, about how they incorporated the social sciences and humanities into their curriculum. Dr. Carley was both a physician and a social scientist with a PhD in anthropology by training. And early on in our interview, she recounted this memory from teaching of hers, and it was fresh in her mind. And I'm going to narrate her recounting this memory for you all, sort of bring us into this world. And then after I'm done, I'll unpack like kind of where I'm going with this and kind of zoom out about what I'll be presenting on today. So she starts by saying, "It's funny. Just today, I got my evals from a lecture that I did. at the medical school about this case that happened a long time ago from my earlier cancer work. And there was this Latina woman. She had been diagnosed with cervical cancer and shuffled all around, all over the place. And doctors are always telling Latinas that they get cervical cancer because they've been sleeping around. So she asked this doctor right before surgery, how come I got this? And he said, well, Anglos tend to get cancer of the breast more and Latinos tend to get cervical cancer. And she said, why is that? And the doctor tells her, because Anglos tend to smoke more, Latinos tend to start having sex at an earlier age and have more sexual partners. Now, Dr. Carly paused and she wanted to let this setup sink in. She sipped her coffee and she continued. She goes, I presented this case to the students not to say, look at this racist doctor. But she wanted to say, look at all this training. He took his epidemiology on how you get cervical cancer or a sexually transmitted infection, and then took the statistics that Latino has higher rates of cervical cancer and just smashed them together. And so it's one of those moments where you're taking all of these things that you're learning and you come up with these ideas that aren't right. She continued, but the students either love me or they hate me. The students didn't like that conversation because they basically just said, I took this example of a racist doctor. We all know he's racist, and just went off with that. And that's not what happened, but it's interesting that that's what their perception of what happened, because they're not seeing the value of the conversation on how easily that could happen. They don't need to be racist. It's going to happen to all of them. They're all getting taught the same things, and one day they're going to say something stupid like that. Does that mean they're racist? Well, I think we're all a little racist, but the goal wasn't to say, look at these racists. The goal was to help them think through how easily these things happen. Stereotyping, misdiagnosis, overlooking diagnosis happen. So I think for those students, the example was a failure. It made me think, how can I do things differently so that I can get at those students that don't get it right away? So Dr. Carly's account is revealing in a number of ways. First, and this is not actually captured in this anecdote, I guess I need to maybe speak more over here. What's not captured in this anecdote is that this was one lecture, the entirety of their 4 years, about stereotyping in medical school. Second, the students were fixated on the racist individual rather than critically interrogating their own knowledge. Third, the students are reflecting what they've already learned, which is that they have clinical faculty routinely teach about decontextualized statistics about social groups, which more on that later. Fourth, students were ill-equipped, right? The students did not love that conversation. They didn't want to talk about it. They're ill-equipped to engage in a critical discussion. And fifth, and finally, as she ended her example, medical educators, individual medical educators, feel personally responsible to change things, right? She was saying, how can I do things better? So again, zooming out from all of this, this is actually kind of the point of departure for my book, which is I spoke to many clinical educators, many medical educators, many even medical students who talked about all of these well-intentioned curricular reforms, particularly about incorporating the social sciences and humanities into their medical education, and how they failed and how they yielded what I call curricular injustices. Now, curricular injustice, just as kind of a brief overview, is when medical educators actually make decisions about curricular practices that, instead of ameliorating social inequalities, indeed maintain them. And this takes on a lot of different forms, some of which I'll highlight today, some of which I won't spend as much time on, but just to kind of, I guess, give the punchline in the beginning, it takes on forms like shoehorning in, I'm so sorry, shoehorning content into meaningless times of the year, which I will focus on. So this is like teaching a one-day lecture, perhaps the day after winter break. devaluing social scientific knowledge and skills, and by having students lead instruction when it's knowledge that students really need to know, faculty are giving that instruction. Obscuring the structural foundations of social inequalities in the content that maybe faculty do deliver. Teaching decontextualized statistics and inaccurate data about social groups. And then this is more with some of the humanities parts, celebrating Eurocentric and kind of white and elite fine art forms, as well as kind of talking about their effortless accomplishment. And then finally, also with the incorporation of the humanities, often as this kind of therapeutic break, imparting these lessons of docility. So teaching students to cope with the discontents of their medical education rather than learn how to challenge them, or at least understand what is happening, right? So kind of teaching stress relief rather than a kind of critical interrogation of power. So we have these well-intentioned ideas about changing the profession. We actually have this curricular injustices. In my book, what I end up taking up answering is why and also how these medical educators' well-intentioned reform efforts, right? They're trying to cultivate these empathic and equitable doctors who don't do things like stereotyping, as Dr. Carly mentioned, and why it is that they failed. And to answer that, it's actually, this is where I kind of will pose this to the room for perhaps our Q&A later. I'm calling this Seedlings for Social Sciences. So this is getting at the kind of title of my talk. So we can think about some of the promises of the social sciences. I'll touch on some of the humanities, but for the sake of this talk, I'll be mostly focusing on the social sciences. So we can think that the social sciences could help us cultivate a critical appreciation for evaluating data, as well as evaluating the medical profession. We could also think about how the social sciences could help us foster a very deep, or medical students foster a deep appreciation for socio-historical context that would inform their patients' health as well as the healthcare inequalities, right? So we can think of those promises. So what I would like to sort of like plant in your brains, if you want to noodle on this as I present, is thinking about how we could collectively imagine what you would want from your own area of expertise, and how you would want medical students to be able to, I guess, learn about that information, and how you would kind of translate your body of knowledge. Because I think, as I will not spend a ton of time on, but social scientists, by and large, have not been a large voice in these curricular reform efforts. So that is my little seedling for this. Okay, so in terms of how I went, the data and methods that comprise this book, how I went about answering this, I engaged in in-depth interviews, non-participant observation, and also gathered a lot of curricular materials. So I interviewed medical educators and students, 90 of them at 37 different med schools. I also observed these medical education conferences. That's the AAMC annual meeting. For those not in the know, AAMC stands for the Association of American Medical Colleges. They're the ones that design the MCAT. They're the ones that are in charge of admissions. They're actually incredibly powerful. If you ever want a data set from them, they will charge you up the wazoo and make it. They have a lot of data that's off limits. But they do collect a tremendous amount of data about medical students. And then the curricular materials, all I was able to gather at every single medical school was a list of like course titles and a description of what was taught in those courses. But some schools actually have a tremendous amount of curricular materials available. Okay, happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So the way that I organize my book, and what I'll be speaking a little about with you today and focusing on the social sciences, is the process and then also the politics of knowledge application. So by process, I am sort of thinking about it as like we have, at the national level, these profession-wide dreams about how to shape an ideal medical doctor and train them. Those dreams might materialize in things like curricular standards that then, or even suggestions that then get down to the school level. And that's when people that work at any individual medical school are like, okay, we have these standards, we have these requirements, we have these suggestions. How do we then get those into our specific school's curriculum? And then we have the actual classrooms themselves when faculty are leading instruction. And so that at each step of this, I guess, process, it's very political about whose voice gets heard, whose voice gets excluded, what knowledge counts, what knowledge is seen as, not relevant for every physician to know. And so by breaking down this process, hopefully I'll be able to sort of show how, again, we get these failures. Okay, so to bring us back to our opening example, why is Dr. Carly engaging in this instruction in the first place? We actually have to think about what the contemporary problems for US medicine are. And I'm going to kind of quickly go over these so I can get into the meat of things. But in the book, I describe kind of two central areas of problems that the medical profession is trying to address. And they pose the social sciences and humanities as solutions to these problems. So the first problem bucket is equity problems. And these are things that a lot of social scientists in the room or folks that have helped document. A lot of people have documented these. And these are social inequalities that impact health and healthcare of patients, as well as inequalities in the context of the physician pipeline and workforce. The watershed moment for this was the 2003 Institute of Medicine report that pinpointed the medical profession as being a part of perpetuating these problems. Obviously, our own research, student activism, and then something that I call in the book, which will make more sense in a second as I describe the power of clinical faculty. But it was clinical faculty. So these are physicians that teach in the medical school, their own witnessing of inequalities in the context of their clinic. So so if you think of the current people in positions of power at medical school that are clinical faculty, they have a major gap in their education in terms of learning about social sciences. They came of age when biology and all of the basic sciences reigned supreme. And I think, this idea that if a pill could solve all of our health problems, medicine would have been super down for that. And so these clinical faculty, though, in the actual experiences that they have with their patients, they're witnessing, I didn't realize that not everybody could afford their medication, right? So because they have an entirely different lived experience than so many of their patients, given their salaries and in a lot of cases, their backgrounds. Not all the cases, but certainly in the context of medical schools. So they pose the social sciences as a solution. And in fact, at a kind of national level, at the time of collecting data for this book, some material in social sciences was required for medical schools to teach. The other realm of problems are empathy problems. This is where patients are dissatisfied, or perhaps they're not receiving quality care. And physicians themselves are getting burnt out. Another wide variety of folks have pointed to this problem, right? Patients' rights movements, as well as patient consumerism on the rise, increasing attention to the corporatization of healthcare, as well as physicians' own clinical experience of feeling burnt out or feeling like patients are dissatisfied. And the humanities get pitched as a solution here. In this case, it's much more of suggested material. It's not explicitly required with the exception of bioethics. Okay, so you could think, and as social scientists, you might imagine, why does the medical profession reach for curricular solutions. A lot of these problems, as we can imagine for health and healthcare, have actually nothing to do with doctors in the first place. I mean, certainly a doctor being like interpersonally discriminatory to a patient is their fault, but a lot of the problems happened far prior to any sort of patient entering into the clinic. And so one of the ways that we can think about curricular solutions is that they actually are what they reach for because they're within the profession's control. So by assuming ownership over these solutions to the equity and empathy problems, the profession's actually able to set the agenda and perhaps mitigate against external pressures. And that's why this like 2003 Institute of Medicine report at the federal level, I think, was a really big push for them to have these requirements. So that way they could say, look, we're addressing this, like, don't bother us. Second, and this is something that I don't want to overstate, but I also don't want to understate. And many of us in the room who teach can attest to this, that curricular practices encapsulate infinite potential. I'm teaching a grad seminar in medical sociology in the fall, and I haven't taught it in a few years. And let me tell you, in my mind, I'm going to transform these students' lives. What I'm going to do, I have no idea yet. I don't know any of how I'm going to structure it, but at this moment in time, infinite potential, right? So this is, I think, curricular solutions are, sorry, I'm like going back and forth between the screens. It's the infinite potential of curricular practices that at this profession-wide, it's in their control, but it also can be this sort of vague dreaminess, that potential, that promise goes a really long way. And then third, why do they reach for these bodies of field in general? I think it's because the medical profession, if they understand anything about these bodies of knowledge, they think that they, and have stated, this is actually, that they are about understanding humans. And this is actually something that the AAMC president said when he introduced the new MCAT, which for those in the audience that aren't in this sphere, note the 2015 new MCAT has sociology on it, which is probably why I have a job. Honestly, I'm there to teach the pre-meds. And so again, there is this idea that, okay, these fields, there's something about understanding humans. But again, at this level, it's very vague, it's very dreamy, but the profession is like, all right, we're in control of this. Okay. So they're at this dream phase. There actually are a lot of different ways that the social sciences and humanities are pitched to potentially address these equity and empathy problems. The clinical faculty interpretations end up kind of taking center stage, and I'm going to describe why as we move down this ladder of design. So we got to get to the level now, we're at the profession level, we have these requirements and these standards, and we're at the med school and we're like, okay, what are the social sciences? What are we doing? Okay. Theorizing and explaining how medical schools work is so difficult. I think it's helpful to think about when you're trying to find your way at a hospital and trying to find a doctor and you get lost and disoriented. That's also how medical schools can feel. And in fact, when I was talking to medical educators and students, one of the biggest impressions that came across was this idea that a medical school was incredibly chaotic. And another thing that I'll briefly talk about is that it's the basic scientists that are the problem. And I'll talk about, so this is why I'm saying it's impressions, because statistically speaking, I don't think they can really blame the basic sciences, but there was this overwhelming sense that if you've seen one medical school, you've seen one medical school. And this was a panelist at a AAMC conference panel about incorporating these humanities and social sciences into curricular practices. And so this idea that medical schools are idiosyncratic. Another a participant at a AAMC conference that I sat next to, and I was like, oh, how do you organize your social sciences and humanities? And she was like, oh, medical schools don't organize. They respond to crises. We do crisis management. So again, there was this overwhelming sensation of this chaos. And again, it was also palpable during my visits, as Rawan can attest, and actually now Latanya, as I've been talking about it. If I have any confidence about any skill that I have about myself, it's my sense of direction and orientation. It made field work so fun in terms of like finding people. But I have never felt so insecure. And I'm like, no, I think I'm in the right place. I'm looking at the map and people are like, oh no, they've moved buildings. They're now in the bowels of this basement. So it was there's this, again, overwhelming feeling of like, you don't know who's in charge, who makes decisions. And this is where I kind of want to sort of say that this is really important for, again, thinking about how curricular design happens or curricular reform might happen. Again, this feeling of there is nobody really in charge. Getting to this basic sciences boogeyman part, the clinical faculty, even though they were like, we don't know who's in charge, they would always point to, or more often than not point to, basic scientists as the ones that were, you know, the first ones to panic and about including social sciences and humanities, again, with this idea that it would be taking away from their curricular time. So again, one of the central achievements of this collective impression or perception that of this organizational chaos is that it obscures who's in power and who actually makes decisions. And in reality, the leaders of medical schools do make decisions. And I think they actually really, or a thing that I argue in this book is that this organizational flexibility is actually a key component to these leaders' power. And this shows up a lot in the way that clinical faculty in particular are hired and their compensation structure. It's broken down by percentage time. And often clinical faculty are asked to do volunteer labor because so much of their remuneration comes from seeing patients, right? So it's like the patient side, billing, all of that stuff. And so they're like, yeah, come run this session with medical student. And sometimes it's even pitched as an honor, right? To teach the next generation. So what we know from sociology, though, is that when that these haphazard hiring practices where people just fall into their roles, we know that when any organization, it's not just medical schools, when any organization engages in haphazard hiring practices, people that are already in sort of positions of social power are more likely to be hired, right? This is just like thinking of the kind of like the old boys club of word of math of how they get hired. It's the same thing. So in terms of the numbers of medical schools in the United States, 89% of US medical schools faculty are clinical faculty, meaning they are like most largely MDs. And this number has actually doubled over the last 30 years. So that's both in terms of there are more of them working at smaller percentage times at medical schools, and just kind of increasing in their visibility in general. So nearly 90%, the other 10% are these basic sciences faculty, and the 1% are the other faculty, which would be social scientists or humanists. In the same time period, Black and Latinx underrepresentation has increased. And now that I'm looking at how I worded that, another way to sort of say this is that the representation of Black and Latinx clinical faculty has decreased. So this is a way of saying that the leadership of medical schools is whiter and more clinical, then certainly representative of both like physician populations and certainly patient populations. Okay, so not only are there more white and more clinical folks in charge of curricular design, these haphazard approaches to or this yields haphazard approaches to curricular design and instruction precisely because of this compensation and staffing structure yields high turnover and change. So there's like if a person has a small percentage time here, they get shifted to like, okay, you're now on the GI block now, or, oh, we're going to move you to clinical skills. And so it is this, it's really hard for there to be sort of continuity. So anyways, what am I trying to say here? That once we're at this medical school level, curricular reform is already facing a lot of organizational barriers to implementation, and it sort of shows how white and clinical faculty members are at the helm. So that's what we're going with that. And what this looks like, and this is getting into sort of these curricular injustices, how that impacts what curriculum gets included. So with this red arrow, this is where you can see curricular designers tend to shoehorn in the social sciences into very marginalized parts of the curriculum. So it's probably hard to see from the back, but the week of health policy, they're 1 week relative to everything else that's very biomedical, is in the week immediately after the holiday break. And I had many clinical faculty respondents said that it was because that way, if like there was a flight delay or something, it was okay if they missed it, right? It wasn't the real material. They also engage in incorporating the social sciences as well as humanities, but in this case, the social sciences in what I call inclusion as admissions. And this is where, if you look at the yellow arrow to that longitudinal thread of practice of medicine, that's like their clinical skill. It's like how to deliver bad news and how to take a history of a patient. And that is where they'll teach the social sciences by asking students to teach their peers as well as their faculty based on their lived experience. And so this is where, and this was one of my first papers from my dissertation. Before I wrote the book, I came up with this concept of conscripted curriculum because this was in particularly with discussions about race. Students of color were being asked to teach their peers and faculty members about race based on their lived experience. And again, they weren't, I'm quite obviously white. They weren't asking the white students to be like, okay, why don't you tell us about what it means to be a white person, in the United States? Tell us everything we need to know in this one day, in all 4 years of medical school, right? So this is where, when I would quite literally be asking, course directors, deans of medical schools about when they taught about social science, they would literally answer being like, well, we have a really diverse student population. Right, that was their answer. It wasn't, we have this lecture or that type of thing. I mean, some schools did have a lecture, but so this inclusion as admissions would be the students, by virtue of their social position, would be the curricular content. Again, in the spirit of time, I actually will not talk about, they would do a similar thing with humanities, where they would be to give special preference to students that were really good, again, at these like white elite art forms. And I just want to, I really fought, honestly, myself to keep the humanities in here, because I think the contrast is important, because here students would be admitted because of their adherence to more white elite art forms, and that was like what they were contributing to the student body. In contrast to students who were basically brought in to teach their peers about social inequalities. It gives these visions of who the profession should be. And then the humanities were also offered as an electives, and like I said, happy to talk about the humanities in the Q&A, but I want to talk about how statistics are taught. Okay, so we're now moving along the process into the classroom. And again, this is where faculty with their limited expertise take center stage. So it's going to come across like I'm going to bash clinical faculty. So I do want folks to actually imagine yourself placed in a situation where you're tasked with teaching a field that you know nothing about. And so you're kind of coming into this space. So I will, since I have 5 minutes left, I will sort of briefly get at, these are some of my respondents, both students and faculty, talking about how little of expertise students have, or sorry, the faculty had, and how, in fact, sometimes the faculty members would just skip the section if they didn't. They would be given, and this is again that haphazard approach where they would be like, oh, I'm teaching on endocrinology today. Here are my lecture notes. Oh, I don't know anything about like the racism of this, the predecessor of this field. I'm just gonna like not talk about that, or whatever it is. And so even in faculty development, they didn't want to talk about racism or heteronormativity. Again, the clinical faculties just had a lot of discomfort and a lot of and very limited expertise there. In terms of what they did have was this vast clinical experience, right? So they would talk about, again, this idea of clinical witnessing, where they would, if anyone who was paying attention, they would know that their patients are going to come, you know, from different walks of life. They would realize that if they prescribe something to a patient that can't afford it, that might not like work. And they also talked about how they were in this kind of burnout crisis. So they have the clinical experience, they have limited expertise. So what does this yield? In terms of the social sciences, they taught a very decontextualized and really devalued the social sciences. So they talked, especially with statistics, they would teach statistics about social groups completely devoid of historical or social context. So I will, in my limited time left, I will briefly elaborate 2 examples. So one example is maybe they would be talking in the pulmonology section about asthma, and they would maybe say these are asthma rates in different census tracts, and here's the racial breakdown of these census tracts, right? So they present that, and then they would move on, rather than, right? The students wouldn't learn anything about, say, the Federal Highway Act and how that underwrote the construction of interstates through Black and Brown communities. You know, quite literally creating higher rates of pollution, or they wouldn't learn about how redlining and municipal disinvestment in communities also impacted housing quality and building materials, right? So they're not learning the context of why we would be getting these differential asthma rates, for example. Similarly, right, so that's in thinking of like, again, the structural context of this. They would be learning about rates of kidney failure by race, but the lecture on the nephrology block wouldn't get into how the medical profession's calculation for estimating kidney function had a race-based correction that was, in this case, particularly anti-Black racism, and that it artificially inflated a Black person's kidney function, and therefore the medical profession was absolutely complicit in why a person would have delays in their kidney care, right? So they would be getting just these rates, these statistics, but again, without an understanding of why. Other things that happened in the context of the social sciences is that, and this is tied to that practice of medicine sequence, and it makes sense given the clinical witnessing filter that the educators had, is that they would present social science as a person's lived experience. And obviously, like people do live social inequalities, but students overwhelmingly had this perception that social inequalities or the social science was this merely anecdotal rather than a set of facts that we could learn and know. And then finally, students received really like peppered throughout the curriculum when they would, it's similar to these like decontextualized statistics, inaccurate or stereotypictions of social groups that either used biological or cultural conceptualizations of the social group. And I have a lot of different examples in the book, and I actually, in the spirit of time, I will skip to my conclusion, which I think I need to really, because I had stuff on student reception. Okay. Actually, we'll go here. Great. So in terms of what all this means is that it is this compounded failure, and hopefully you can kind of see that in this process of how knowledge gets applied. So each step along this process of knowledge is an opportunity for deliberation and contention. But in the context of US medical education, there are a lot of barriers in place that place clinical faculty in positions of power, as well as really hide the leaders that are making these decisions, right? So I don't want to completely just implicate the singular individual clinical faculty, because they're not in good working conditions either, although they do need to learn more. And so these clinical faculty lacking the expertise, they are unable to teach students these critical and reflective lessons from the social sciences and humanities. So to move towards curricular justice, some schools do invest, leaders invest in intellectual infrastructure, right? They have experts that actually have the substantive expertise, and they give them the curricular power to make these changes. And perhaps I'm a little too hopeful. This was maybe what I saw when I finished the book, and it's very important to note that the book was finished up in July of 2024, and some things have changed since the summer of 2024. But I was hopeful a little bit about generational change and cohort replacement, and with this MCAP, but I'm hoping sociology can make a difference. But I thank you all for your attention, and I would love to think through how we could all change the world.
Kind of on that last note, thank you for this. That's super interesting. On the last note about generational change, we talk a little bit more if there were some meetings where students were sort of aware. They saw that I saw some of like sort of aware of what they were missing and in opposition to maybe teams for like this kind of team students.
Yes. So big fan of comparative design. The students, and I skipped over my student reception part. Students were definitely able to kind of, I think, call out the way that faculty either were bad at delivering the content, didn't know what they were doing, or made it feel meaningless. I say that though, but a lot of students also contributed to the devaluation where they also thought it was a waste of their time. That said, I did, and this could be an artifact of like how my medical student sample snowballed into the group that it did. There were students, particularly students from socially marginalized backgrounds, that did often push back against their faculty, and that they were either met with apathy, which a lot of them like obviously did not like, where so they're like, oh yes, like the medical school course directors were like, yes, tell us how we should change the curriculum, and then they would deliver that to them, and then the course directors would just like toss it, and no change would actually be made. Or some students got in trouble. And we're kind of told to like fall in line. One student talked about how a faculty member was like, your activism is getting in the way of your real studies, because they were trying to draw attention to how messed up it was of like to teach race as biological in their curriculum. So I do think though medical student resistance has been somewhat effective even in building cross medical school coalition. So White Coats for Black Lives put out like a report card, like grading medical schools, you know, how they incorporate race into their curriculum. A lot of these students too have been able to effectively publish on this at some in bigger medical journals. So I actually think that there are some ways that some of the change is happening, but maybe not within like individual medical schools, and actually going like to the knowledge base itself. So actually I was speaking about this earlier, but like it was a group of medical students at University of Washington that got rid of, at the level, first it was UW's like med eds, or, you know, hospital system. Then Harvard followed suit. Then the Nephrology Association did it. They got rid of the race-based correction for kidney function, which is like a massive accomplishment, you know, like, so it's like, so I think it's like maybe not at the level of the medical schools, at least as organizations are, I think, maybe more repressive for student activism than maybe working around it or cross coalition building. I don't know if I actually really answered your question, but I took it to a place. Oh my gosh. Okay. I don't go for it, Bob. Yes.
Well, many of you here teach, and it's interesting what you just presented to me, coming from a system where medicine is a career that people choose when they're 18. So the curriculum in the School of Medicine is all they get.
Yeah.
It's very different, I think, from here, where they do have allegedly 3 or 4 years of bachelor's, where they should be learning other things. It's very interesting to see how you're analyzing the information you give, how the students talked about, compared what they were learning before, or from what you were saying. I honestly, so many of the problems that I face teaching lots of pre-med, lower film, and now that the college of art sciences is a minor in health sciences, it makes me think a lot, like we're just reproducing the same.
Yes.
Like the same issues of curriculum that you're presenting and the same things that I see where students are like, oh, why don't I go to your class as anthropology? Where do I waste time? I should be studying my chemistry out. Or they just tell me I couldn't come to class because I have to teach. So
yes.
I don't know how you see that. Those 4 and 7 years. You know.
Yes. So it is such a good question, and I think, I mean, there, as one can critique any research, one of the directions. Oh, I'm going to repeat the question, which is, is this also happening in pre-med? I think is how I'll restate it. Compared to other systems, yeah. I mean, I think it is. This speaks to the broader politics of academia. I certainly at Temple, and I teach this class of pre-med, and like I said, it's how I even got a job. I mean, maybe no universities wouldn't have cared about medical sociologists in 2018 if it weren't for the MCAT adding it and giving us this like boost of relevance. But I do think it is absolutely reproduced at that level. I get students that orgo professors are like, oh, well, we're just, you can stay late for your exam. And so students are like, well, of course I'm going to miss my sociology class. And I was saying like earlier that one of my, I would say like most consistently an evaluation line I get is like, I can't believe I learned something. Like I didn't know sociology was like, like it's like this like shock to them that they learned in a non-science course. And so then it's like thinking of actually like where that's coming from. I do think it is the structure of the university. I do think it is also, though, again, this culture that is so like teach to the test, and that they need to do, and that's again what the only reason why they're in my class is because of the MCAT. Compared to other, I don't know as much about the whether pre-med or pre-med equivalent in other countries. And that is something that I should look into. Gosh, I don't know how to choose.
Is that an online?
Okay. Okay. Sure.
They're both about the license.
Mm.
So, as someone said, once in medical school, step one and step two exam content is a huge driver of curriculum. That they're going to move to include more content and social intervention health experience. And similarly, the other question was about should we be pushing more content like sociology and other social sciences in those licensing.
Should I repeat the question? Okay.
Because they can see them.
Okay, great. So not a lot of content currently. I think, in fact, I think we're with the Trump administration, we're going to be seeing more of a rollback at the professional level, because the LCME rolled back about like what kinds of like structural competencies and the types of social science they require. I do think that is a role that I think there needs to be more pressure from the ASA, the AAA, like more of our social sciences, like professional associations, because that is actually how, like in the UK, they were able to, like sociology is like deeply embedded in the curriculum because of the mobilization. It's like, it's a great act. It's like BEST, like behavioral and social sciences training. And it's also a little bit easier though, because there's like a fraction of the amount of medical schools. But I think the answer is yes, we need to push for that. Ooh.
Great talk, it's really interesting stuff. I was also wondering about some of the global aspects of this. And I think that like 25% of the million doctors in the United States were educated abroad. So both, have you looked into how ideas from abroad mix into this? How some portion of those docs, maybe more or maybe less than 25%, are in these academic medical centers where they're doing training. And then just generally, are there things happening differently in different training systems that we might want to copy or use?
Yes, so this was a question about kind of global training and particularly maybe about immigration of physicians trained abroad into the United States. So from my understanding of the physician workforce that has migrated into the United States, it's actually that they tend to be slotted in not at academic medical centers, and that they actually get placed into I guess healthcare organizations that have less pay and have less power. So I actually think, and this is particularly the case for residency in the United States. So Tanya Jenkins has a great book about this where she's able to show they have objectively higher STEP scores, but they are, I think, due to the xenophobia and there's like kind of thinly veiled racism where it's like they're not, they won't understand the culture of American patients. They are like these internationally trained medical graduates are least likely to be picked for say University of Washington's, actually I shouldn't say, I don't know how University of Washington selects for residency, but like a top academic medical center, they're much more likely to select US trained MDs. So my guess is that they would have less curricular power, even if they would have lessons to impart, again, with how med schools are organized.
Well, join me in thanking Dr. Lauren. Questions or anything, please feel free to come up and talk.